Jack Mercer, an old veteran who lost a leg in the war, lives with his wife Linda, son Brandon, daughter-in-law Tessa, and grandson Caleb. During dinner, Brandon calls his father a burden and forces Jack to sign the property transfer papers, while Tessa pretends to care, but her eyes are full of calculation. Linda just stays silent and avoids him, making Jack realize that this family is plotting to take everything. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. You're nothing but a burden we're forced to feed. Brandon Mercer didn't spit the words, he delivered them clean and deliberate, like a man signing his name where he's sure the ink will never smear. The chandelier above our dining table hummed. Caleb's fork scraped a ditch through his mashed potatoes. The roast steamed and smelled overcooked. Across from me, my wife Linda lowered her eyes like the sentence belonged to me, not to him. I set my spoon down. The small metallic click rang louder than his insult. I've heard mortars bark and doors blow in. I know the sound of a line being crossed. Say that again, I said, calm as a winter field. He leaned back in his chair, lips curving into a half smile that used to be a boy's grin before it hardened into a man's entitlement. You heard me, Dad. He didn't lower his voice for Tessa, his wife, or their boy, or for the family portraits watching from the wall. That was the point. Shame is a crowd sport, if you let it be. I looked at him the way you study a distant ridge through heat shimmer patiently, knowing clarity arrives if you hold steady. My prosthetic throbbed where it meets the old scar, a stubborn drumbeat that never quite ends. It didn't hurt as much as the room did. Tessa's diamond bracelet caught a splinter of light, a quiet flag of things acquired. Caleb giggled at nothing because he didn't yet understand what it means to turn on your own. Linda moved a pea around her plate with the tip of her knife. Nobody said my name. Eat, Linda murmured to the table, or to herself, I couldn't tell. I have been called many things, Sergeant. Husband, father. Each title cost something to earn and something else to keep. I lost a piece of my leg on a road that looked safe until it wasn't. I never imagined I'd lose the plain dignity of being spoken to as a man under a roof I paid for, at a table I built with a name, Jack Mercer, that I carried home from a war intact. Brandon cleared his throat the way he does when he's about to pretend concern. You should sign the papers, he said. Let me handle things before there's a problem. Tessa slid in behind him like a shadow learning to speak. We all want what's best for you, Jack. It's a lot to manage at your age. Her smile was soft. Her eyes were not. I've seen that look in checkpoint mirrors and backroom deals. It never means what it says. I angled my cane against the chair, stood, and let the table creak under the shift of weight. I'm stretching my leg, I told Caleb when he blinked up at me. He laughed because the wooden part still fascinates him, a toy masquerading as a burden. I nodded to him, then to no one, and walked down the hallway past the glass cabinet that holds our life like a museum no one actually visits anymore. On the top shelf sits a faded photo, me at 24, in Class A's Linda Bright beside me, her fingers doing what they always did, then hooking into the crook of my arm like belief. I didn't take the frame down. I don't negotiate with ghosts while the living misbehave. In the bathroom mirror, my hair looked more gray than I remembered that morning. The face was mine, though the one I carried through sandstorms and sterile wards, the one that learned to listen the way some men learn to brag. War taught me two things that never fail. Patience outlasts noise, and silence is a weapon if you know where to aim it. I returned to the table and sat. I cut a piece of roast, chewed, swallowed, and set my fork down in a deliberate rhythm. Brandon bounced his knee. Tessa refolded her napkin twice. Linda kept her eyes on a far corner, pretending there was something to see there. Linda, I said, She flinched at her name. Yes, coffee after dinner. Of course, she said, and it sounded like appointment more than comfort. Brandon's jaw tightened. Dad, the bank will call tomorrow. Don't sign anything until I get back from my meeting. I'll handle it. He broke the word into parts, like I needed help digesting the syllables. I'll keep that in mind, I said. He didn't hear the thing I meant him to hear. I will keep it in my mind. Not his, not theirs. Mine. The gravy had cooled to a skin. The ceiling fan ticked like a slow metronome. I counted the beats and let an old muscle memory uncoil, map the room mark, the threats pick your ground. I lifted my water and took a long drink, not because I was thirsty, but because time is a tool, and I've never minded the taste of it. Tessa leaned in her bracelet, flashing again. It's just paperwork, she said, the way a man with a shovel calls a grave a hole. Why make things complicated? Complication, I said, is just the part of the truth that refuses to be rushed. Brandon scoffed. Caleb's fork clattered to the floor, and he crawled under the table for it, small and oblivious, spared by childhood from the weight adults make for themselves. I watched him disappear into the dark undercarriage of our lives, and thought some things are worth rescuing. Some things need to find their own way out. When the plates were cleared, Linda made coffee. She set a mug in front of me without meeting my eyes. It smelled like the mornings when we both still believed that surviving meant we were done with fighting. Thank you, I said. She nodded and drifted back to the sink hands in the ritual of rinsing what can't be washed clean. Brandon smoothed his tie like the conversation had wrinkled it. Think about what I said. I already am, I told him. He paused. He wanted a fight or a surrender. He wasn't built for the third option, a man who takes his time. When they were finally gone, Brandon's aftershave still hanging in the air like a cheap boast, Tessa's perfume like a receipt. I stayed at the table and listened to the house breathe. Old wood talks in winter. The furnace coughed. A pipe answered. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse negotiated with a crumb. Familiar sounds, faithful ones. I slid my hand over the table's scar where somebody set a too-hot pan back in '98. And I remembered Caleb's father as a boy running a toy car up and down this edge, making engine noises, looking at me with the uncomplicated awe sons reserve for fathers who haven't disappointed them yet. It's one thing to survive losing a limb. It's another to survive losing the benefit of the doubt from your own blood. I carried my mug down the hall into my study and closed the door. The lock clicked. Not a barricade. A boundary. The desk lamp threw a small circle over the old metal box where I keep what matters. I didn't open it yet. I just sat, breathed, counted. Let the adrenaline leak out of my fingers. A good plan is never built in anger. It's assembled in the hush that follows. They want signatures, I thought. They want access and a story that paints theft as caretaking. They want me smaller than the paperwork they push across the table. The problem is simple. They think age is a weakness. The cause is simpler, greed dressed as concern. The solution will not be loud. I pulled the top drawer and took out a field notebook, tan cover, rounded corners, pages that take ink like a promise. On the first line, I wrote the only order that has ever worked for men like me. Plan, then peace. Under it, I listed what a soldier lists when the perimeter feels compromised: inventory secure, verify, observe. People think investigations are made of questions. They're made of lists. My hand didn't shake. Rage makes you sloppy. Patience keeps your handwriting steady. From the wall, the photo of younger us watched me, the kid in uniform, the bride with sunlight for a smile. I didn't apologize to them. If they wanted guarantees, they should have stayed in the frame. I capped the pen, set it beside the notebook, and finally opened the metal box deeds account summaries, a folded letter from Victor Hale, a man who knew the difference between a court date and a firefight, and respected both. Everything where I left it for now. Tomorrow I would count again. I would study the paper trail the way I used to study patrol routes. I would listen more than I spoke. I would let Brandon measure himself against the silence and hear how big it is. For tonight, I lifted the mug, tasted the last of the coffee gone lukewarm, and let the room settle around me. Out past the window, November pressed its face to the glass. Somewhere down our street, a dog barked, then thought better of it. In my chest, the old drumbeat slowed. "You're nothing but a burden," my son had said. I had believed worse things, and outlived the men who said them. I turned off the lamp. The click sounded like a switch that only moves one way. Patience, not rage. Watch the corners. Hold your ground. The next move would be mine, and when it came, it would not sound like a shout. It would sound like a door opening and a man walking through it under his own power. The night after that dinner, silence filled the house like smoke after an explosion. Thick, choking, impossible to ignore. Linda slipped into bed beside me. Her back turned, her breaths even too practiced to be sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling cracks, tracing them like fault lines on a map, thinking how quickly ground that once seemed steady could shift. My mind drifted back to a desert road thousands of miles away. Dust in the teeth, sun burning so hot the air shimmered like oil on water. The moment the ground buckled when the IED sent me flying, I'd thought my life ended right there. Instead, it was just my leg that stayed behind. I remember the medics shouting the smell of cordite, mixed with sand, the blur of faces above me as they tried to stop the bleeding. I woke in a hospital with the truth hammered into my skull: you'll never walk unassisted again. But I did. Crutches, prosthetic, pain as constant companion. And yet I walked because that's what soldiers do. Back then, when I rolled through our front door on metal and determination, Linda clutched my hand like she'd never let go. She pressed her forehead to mine and whispered that survival was enough, that I was enough. Brandon was 10 then, wide-eyed, holding my uniform cap in his hands like it was a crown. He asked about medals, about bravery, about whether heroes ever got tired. He looked at me with a reverence so pure, I thought it would last forever. Memory has a cruel way of fading. Gratitude fades faster. Now at this table, my own blood branded me a burden, and my wife lowered her eyes instead of raising her voice. What the battlefield didn't strip from me, my family's betrayal tried to finish. But silence is not surrender. In war, the men who panicked, who shouted, who fired too soon, they died first. The ones who lived learned patience. They listened. They watched. They waited for the enemy to reveal himself. I have survived on patience before. I would survive on it again. When Brandon leaned across the table earlier that night, whispering to Tessa, their conspiratorial tilt looked too familiar. I had seen that exact posture in insurgents trading intel, in officers padding their pockets, in men who measured others not by loyalty, but by what could be taken. Tessa's bracelet gleamed as she leaned into him, her victory trinket bought on the back of my labor. Linda's fork dragged lazy lines through gravy, her silence screaming louder than words. That room wasn't my family anymore. It was a battlefield. I let my gaze drift toward the cabinet in the corner, where a black and white photograph still stood framed. A younger me, 24, upright, in uniform. Linda beside me, radiant, her smile, the kind you only wear when you believe in someone completely. Looking at that picture was like staring at a stranger. Once upon a time, Jack Mercer meant something. He was a soldier, a provider, a protector. Now my son said I was only dead weight. But if war taught me anything, it's that identity is forged in fire, and betrayal can sharpen it. The scar where my leg used to be was proof of survival, not surrender, and I intended to show them that even now. The scrape of a fork snapped me back. Brandon leaned forward again, his tone slick. "Dad, it's time to make things easier on everyone. Sign the papers. It's for the best." Tessa slid in smoothly. "We only want to help. You can't manage everything anymore, not with your condition. My condition." That word carried the stink of dismissal, as if flesh missing below the knee somehow hollowed out the mind above it. I met her gaze evenly. "You want the house?" Brandon's jaw twitched. He didn't deny it. That was all the confirmation I needed. I didn't give them anger. Anger is reckless. Anger feeds the enemy. I gave them something else, a polite smile, a nod, and the promise of patience. I excused my self-cane tapping on the floorboards and left them in their little huddle of entitlement. In the hallway mirror, I caught my reflection. The eyes were hollow, the jawline harder than I remembered. But beneath the gray hair and the stiff shoulders lived the same man who had crawled through dust and fire, who had survived shrapnel and silence. That man wasn't gone. He was waiting. And now he had seen enough. I walked into my study, closed the door, and exhaled for the first time all evening. On the desk sat a dented metal box. Inside were the artifacts of a lifetime property, deeds, bank ledgers, letters from Victor Hale, an old friend, now an attorney. And at the very bottom, folded crisp, the American flag from a comrade's funeral. The kind of reminder that tells you strategy saves lives. When I lifted the lid, my stomach dropped. A folder was thinner than it should have been. My life insurance copy gone. I never misplace important papers. That meant someone had been in here. The lock wasn't forced, no scratches, no sign of struggle. Whoever it was had either found my key or made a duplicate. That narrowed the list of suspects down to 2. Brandon or Linda. The truth struck sharper than the insult at the table. This wasn't just a careless word. This was strategy. A campaign. And it had already begun long before Brandon ever called me a burden out loud. I locked the box again and sat down with the old field notebook I always kept close. On the first line, I wrote, "Plan then peace," because this war, my war, was only just beginning. The morning after that dinner, I moved slower than usual, not because of the leg, but because of the weight in my chest. Linda brewed coffee, the scent of it curling through the kitchen like an old friend that no longer fit in the house. She poured a mug for me, slid it across the counter without looking at me, and then busied herself with the sink. Her silence had a shape now heavy, deliberate. I sipped the coffee, let the bitter heat settle into me, and reminded myself of the rule I had written the night before. Plan then peace. When the dishes were stacked and the house quiet, I limped back into my study, shut the door, and set the cane against the wall. The metal box on my desk waited like a sentry. I pulled it closer, turned the key, and lifted the lid. Each document inside had been organized with military precision deeds. Bank transfers, account summaries, insurance policies, letters from Victor Hale. I had built this archive as carefully as a sandbag wall, each piece a barrier against chaos. But last night I had felt it the folder was too light. I ran my fingers through the stacks, checking them one by one. The deeds were still there, yellowed at the edges, but intact. The bank transfer copies, stamped and dated, accounted for. Victor's letters folded neatly in their envelopes, still in place. But the copy of my life insurance policy gone. I froze. I never misplace anything in this box. I never allow disorder. That policy had sat in the same folder for years, untouched, as steady as the prosthetic strapped to my leg. And now it was missing. The lock showed no scratches, no marks of forced entry. Whoever had taken it had done so cleanly with a key or with a duplicate. That narrowed the field to 2 people, Brandon or Linda. The thought made my chest tighten. It was one thing for my son to hurl insults at me across the dinner table, one thing for him to hunger after the house I built and the accounts I managed. But it was another thing entirely to find evidence that someone inside this home had already breached the line. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was sabotage. I sat heavily in my chair, the springs groaning under me, and rested my palms against the wood grain of the desk. The study felt different now. The air seemed thinner, sharper. This wasn't a refuge anymore. It was contested ground. I pulled my field notebook closer and opened to the first page. Plan, then peace. I underlined it twice. Beneath it I wrote the new reality. Life insurance copy missing. Box compromised. Suspects Brandon or Linda. Strategy already in motion. I stared at the words until they stopped shaking. War isn't won by what you feel, it's won by what you can prove. Linda's footsteps passed the study door light, almost hesitant. For a moment I considered opening it, asking her directly. But no confrontation without proof is just noise. And noise feeds the enemy. I let her pass. Instead, I unlocked the drawer of my desk and pulled out a recorder. It was old, the kind I once used to dictate notes when typing wasn't practical, but it still worked. I set it on the desk, pressed the button, and listened to the quiet hiss that filled the room. This would be my weapon. Not shouting, not threats, recordings, evidence. I thought back to my days in uniform, to ambushes sprung in deserts where silence meant survival. The lesson carved itself into me then, and it hadn't dulled. Don't fire first. Let them reveal themselves. Let them think they're safe. Then document everything. I closed the box, turned the key, and placed a strip of clear tape across the latch, just enough that it would break if opened again. Invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. If someone came back, I would know. Then I turned to the notebook again. Next to the word evidence, I wrote, recorder under dining table. Safe deposit box check. Contact Victor. The pen moved smoothly steady, as if it belonged to a younger man, a man still marching through heat and dust, counting heartbeats between mortar rounds. I leaned back in the chair, exhaled slowly, and let the plan settle into me like armor. They thought they had me cornered. They thought insult and silence meant victory. But I had survived worse with less. This house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a battlefield. And if they wanted war, then war was what they would get on my terms, in my time with my weapons. That night I returned to my study after the house had gone quiet, the only sound the steady hum of the furnace and the occasional creak of winter settling into the wood. I opened the field notebook again and placed it in the center of the desk, as though it were a map spread out before a campaign. At the top of the page, the words I'd written the night before stared back at me. Plan, then peace. Beneath it, I began to list the tasks that would form the spine of my defense. 1. Check safe deposit box. If papers here were missing, I needed to confirm the originals at the bank. Anything compromised inside this house would be untouchable there. 2. Contact Victor Hale. Not just as a lawyer, but as a comrade. He knew me in uniform, knew my mind was still sharp. His testimony would matter if this escalated. 3. Install recorder. Evidence would be the only language that mattered in court. Every whisper, every smirk, every plot disguised as concern had to be captured. 4. Review will drafts. My last version was years old, outdated, vulnerable. I would need to update it on my own terms, not theirs. I underlined each task like it was an order from command. The lamp cast a narrow cone of light across the desk. Beyond it, shadows crowded the corners of the room. I let the silence stretch. listening the way I once listened in a desert night, when every shifting pebble might have meant the enemy was near. Here the enemy wasn't crouched in the dunes. He was under my roof blood of my blood. The study smelled faintly of old paper and coffee grounds. In the corner against the wall sat a trunk I hadn't opened in years. Inside were medals, service ribbons, photographs of men who never came home. They had faced enemies without mercy and met them head-on. My war was different, but no less brutal. Instead of bullets, it would be signatures. Instead of shrapnel, betrayal. But the discipline was the same: observe, prepare, strike only when the target is exposed. I wrote again. Evidence is ammunition. Patience is armor. When I capped the pen, my hand felt steady. My heartbeat slowed. The room settled into stillness, and I knew that the first phase of this fight had begun not with a shout, not with a slammed door, but with ink on paper. Later, when I returned to the dining room to finish the meal they'd abandoned, I studied the faces around the table. Brandon laughed too loudly at something Tessa whispered. Caleb tapped his peas with his fork. Linda moved food around her plate, her eyes still avoiding mine. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I memorized instead. The angle of Brandon's smirk, the way Tessa touched his arm, like she was steadying him, the tiny flicker of guilt or fear in Linda's eyes, when she glanced up and quickly away. Evidence lives in expressions as much as it does in papers. When I lifted my glass, Brandon caught my gaze. For just a moment, his grin faltered. I smiled faintly, not with warmth, but with promise. Let him wonder what I knew. Because soon enough, every word, every look, every scheme they thought was hidden in whispers would be laid out plain. And then, when the time came, the record would speak louder than all their pretended concern. The plan was simple. The plan was patient. The plan was mine. The next morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of winter light that seeps in weakly through the blinds. I sat at the kitchen table cane, propped against my chair, watching the steam curl from my coffee. Brandon had already left for whatever meeting he claimed would keep him busy, and Tessa was upstairs fussing with Caleb. Linda moved quietly around the sink, her motions deliberate, as if each plate rinsed could wash away the silence between us. I excused myself after breakfast, telling Linda I was going for a walk, and slipped into the study instead. The recorder lay on the desk where I'd left it. Old boxy, but reliable. I tucked it into my jacket pocket and made my way to the dining room. The table that had once held birthdays, holidays, and Sunday roasts now felt like a stage where betrayal rehearsed its lines. I crouched down slowly, the prosthetic creaking, and pressed the device against the underside of the table. A strip of dark tape hid it from casual eyes. I tested the button. The faint red glow blinked once, then disappeared, swallowed by shadow. Perfect. I straightened, adjusted my jacket, and left the house deliberately, a grocery bag swinging from my hand to sell the lie. Outside, the air bit cold against my face. I walked slowly down Main Street, greeting familiar faces, forcing my voice into lightness when neighbors asked after my leg. Still holding me up, I'd reply the same as always. But in truth, my mind wasn't on the sidewalk beneath me. It was back in that dining room under that table, listening. After 2 hours, I returned. The house was quiet, too quiet, like children caught misbehaving. Linda sat in the living room folding laundry, her face composed, but her hands moving too quickly. Upstairs, a door shut softly, Tessa's work. Brandon wasn't home yet. I went straight to the study, locked the door, and pulled out the recorder. My hands were steady as I pressed play. At first, only the scrape of chairs, Caleb's small voice asking about juice. Then a shuffle, a lowered whisper. Tessa's voice sharper than sugar ever allowed it to be. He suspects something. My breath caught. Then Brandon, his tone dripping with disdain. Of course he does, but he can't stop what's coming. We just need him to sign. If he refuses, we'll prove he's unfit. I've already spoken to someone about guardianship. Guardianship. The word curdled in my stomach. It wasn't just the house, not just the accounts. They meant to strip me of everything, my decisions, my name, my dignity. Tessa again, low and quick. He won't last long anyway. We just need to push. A pause. Then Linda's voice, softer, weary. Maybe he already knows about the papers. Silence stretched in the recording. Then Brandon snapped. Then we'll make him believe it's his idea. I stopped the tape. My fingers trembling, then pressed play again, just to be sure. The words came the same. Clear. Cold. Betrayal in my own blood's voice. I set the recorder down on the desk and stared at it as though it were alive. Evidence. Proof. Not suspicion. Not paranoia, fact. The woman who once kissed my scars, who once whispered that survival was enough, was now speaking in the same breath as the people plotting my undoing. I leaned back in the chair, exhaled slowly, and let the fury pass through me without consuming me. Rage is a wild dog. Once it gets loose, it bites whoever's closest. No, I would stay patient. Precise. I picked up the notebook and wrote 3 words across a fresh page. Stage 1 complete. Beneath it, recorder effective. Guardianship plan confirmed. Linda's role uncertain, complicit, or resigned. I underlined the last line, twice the ink, digging deep enough to dent the page beneath. That evening, dinner was served again, as though nothing had shifted. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, the ordinary rituals of family. Brandon laughed too loudly at his phone. Tessa poured gravy with practiced sweetness. Linda kept her eyes low. I ate in silence, my fork, steady, my mind sharper than it had been in years. They thought they had me cornered, that the old man with the limp was too blind to see the net closing around him. But they had forgotten one truth. A soldier doesn't panic when the trap is sprung. He studies the wire, measures the ground, and waits for the right moment to cut it. And tonight I had proof in my pocket that the battlefield was already mine. The following morning I rose before the sun, the old ache in my leg waking me long before the alarm clock ever could. I dressed carefully, shirt tucked, jacket, zipped shoes polished as best as I could manage, and tucked the recorder into my coat pocket. Its weight was small, but the evidence inside felt heavier than any rucksack I had ever carried in the desert. I made my way into town, the bus ride jostling my prosthetic against the floor, every bump a reminder that I'd learned to endure worse. The courthouse and the bank weren't far, but I wasn't going there first. No, first I needed a man who could help me turn whispers into weapons. Victor Hale's office sat on the corner of Maple and Main, a modest brick building with a tarnished brass plaque out front. Inside, the floorboards groaned with age and the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Victor looked up as soon as I entered, his glasses sliding low on his nose. His hair had gone silver since the last time we'd seen each other, but the strength in his handshake was the same. "Jack Mercer," he said, smiling with something more than politeness. "It's been too damn long." "Too long," I agreed, gripping his hand firmly. He gestured to a chair, and I lowered myself into it, the wood creaking under my weight. For a moment we were just 2 old soldiers sharing the silence of recognition. Then I set the recorder on his desk and pressed play. The hiss gave way to voices, Tessa's sharp whisper, Brandon's cold calculation, Linda's weary assent. We listened together. Victor's expression hardened with each word, his jaw tightening, like a man listening to incoming fire. When the recording ended, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "You were right to bring this to me," he said. That's not just talk, that's intent. Guardianship, I muttered, tasting the word like iron. He nodded grimly. They're building a case, but what they don't understand is that every word you've captured is ammunition. You've got leverage now. You can fight this on your terms. I leaned forward. What kind of fight are we talking about? The kind fought with paperwork and patience. First, we secure every document. Nothing leaves your control without your consent. Second, we build a record. Proof of your competence. Financial statements, medical evaluations, daily routines. The stronger that foundation, the harder it'll be for them to paint you as unfit. Third, we keep collecting. Recordings witnesses anything that shows this isn't about care, it's about control. I nodded slowly. Evidence as ammunition, paperwork as armor. Victor's eyes softened, a rare thing for a man who had seen what we'd seen. Exactly. Jack, don't let emotion cloud this. You've always been a strategist. This isn't a battlefield with bullets, but the stakes are just as high. You've got to outthink them, not outshout them. We spent nearly an hour together going over details. He pulled forms from his drawers, highlighted sections with quick strokes of his pen, spoke of affidavits and notarizations, the way we used to speak of coordinates and supply lines. By the time I stood to leave, I had a folder of tasks under my arm and the old steadiness of discipline in my chest. Victor gripped my shoulder as I turned to go. You're not alone in this, Jack. We fought together once, and I'll fight with you again. Only this time the enemy's wearing suits instead of uniforms. I looked him in the eye and nodded. Then we fight smart. Stepping back into the cold air, I felt sharper than I had in years. The sidewalks of Main Street looked different, the corners harder, each passerby a potential witness, each storefront a reminder that gossip travels faster than truth. But I carried something my son and his wife didn't expect: patience, precision, and an ally who knew exactly how to turn whispers into weapons. By the time I reached home, the decision was already clear. Stage 2 of my plan had begun. The recorder had given me proof. Victor had given me strategy. Now it was time to test both. I didn't strike right away. A soldier knows better than to show his hand too soon. Instead, I began to seed the ground, planting rumors like tripwires, where Brandon would least expect them. That afternoon, I made a deliberate trip to the bank. The marble floor echoed beneath my cane. As I crossed the lobby, the sound crisp and sharp. Behind the counter, Paul Eaton, a man who once served on the town council, looked up and greeted me with the politeness reserved for old veterans. We shook hands firmly. I made sure my voice carried just enough for the ears waiting in line nearby. Yes, I said, nodding. I'll need to review the terms of transferring some assets. When you're moving large sums, you want everything airtight. Paul raised his brows slightly but followed my lead, offering me a polite smile. He understood. Small towns thrive on whispers, and I had just handed them their first course. From there, I stopped at Ruth Turner's bakery, the bell above the door jingling softly as I entered. Ruth had known me since before Brandon was born. She slid a loaf of bread into a paper bag, and I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough to invite curiosity. Might be making some big changes soon? I said. Can't leave things scattered? Her brows arched in intrigue, and I knew the words would ride out of that bakery before the bread even cooled. By evening, half the street would be buzzing with talk of Jack Mercer moving money, shifting property, perhaps even changing his will. That was exactly the point. When I returned home, Brandon's car was already in the driveway. He paced the porch with his phone pressed to his ear, voice raised sharp. I don't know. He's up to something. Just keep your end ready. His words cut through the cold air before he spotted me. Then he froze, shoved the phone into his pocket, and forced a smile. Bank called, he said casually. Just some paperwork. Nothing to worry about. Of course, I said smoothly, brushing past him. My cane thudded against the porch wood in a rhythm steady as a drumbeat. Inside, my pulse matched it. The seed had already sprouted faster than I imagined. That evening, dinner carried a new tension. Brandon tried to act at ease, but his eyes flicked to me more often than usual. Finally, he broke the silence. "Dad, if you're moving money around, we should talk. I can help. It's complicated handling those accounts." I carved a piece of chicken, slowly savoring the quiet before I answered. "Complication," I murmured, "is just another word for opportunity. Don't you agree?" His fork paused mid-air. Linda's eyes flicked between us, uneasy. Tessa forced a laugh that sounded thin and brittle. "Jack's always been independent," she said lightly. "It's one of his strengths. Or weaknesses." Brandon muttered low but audible. I set my fork down, letting the silence stretch long enough to press against him like a weight. Then, without another word, I picked it up again and continued eating. Silence, when wielded with purpose, unnerves more than shouting ever could. After dinner, I returned to my study, opened the notebook, and wrote the new entry with steady hands. Stage 2 effective. Rumors seeded. Paranoia rising. Beneath it, I underlined a single sentence until the paper nearly tore. They think they're in control. They aren't. The game had shifted. Brandon and Tessa no longer laughed with certainty. They whispered in corners, their eyes darting. Linda folded laundry with tighter shoulders, her silence carrying the weight of suspicion. And me? I sat in my study with my notes and my recorder, letting the house creak and the clock tick, every sound a reminder that patience sharpens the blade. They thought they were circling me, but in truth I was circling them. 2 days later, I made a trip to the hardware store Kane, tapping against the worn floorboards as I asked about a new lock for my study. The clerk behind the counter, a young man with grease on his hands, barely looked up until a voice called from behind me. "Jack." I turned and saw Kevin Brooks, a neighbor I'd known for years. He worked part-time at the courthouse, a quiet man who noticed more than he said. His eyes flicked around the aisle before he lowered his voice. "I don't know if I should say this," he murmured, "but I saw your son down at the records office last week. He was asking questions about guardianship filings. Looked serious." The weight of those words settled into me like sandbags. I kept my face calm. "Did he file anything?" "Not yet," Kevin replied, but he wasn't just curious. He was taking notes, asking about evidence testimony, what it would take. He looked determined. I thanked him, bought the lock, and left the store with my grip tighter on the cane. Confirmation. The tape had already told me the truth, but now someone outside these walls had seen it too. My suspicions weren't shadows anymore, they had footprints. That evening at dinner, I let my words carry double meanings. I cut into the roast, chewed slowly, and spoke casually, as if recalling a chance encounter. "Funny thing I said ran into Kevin Brooks today. Always interesting what people are looking up at the courthouse." I didn't glance at Brandon, but I didn't need to. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. Tessa's smile faltered. Linda shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting to me, then away. I lifted my glass and drank, letting silence press into the cracks. Later, Brandon cornered me in the living room, his voice sharp. "Why are you talking to Kevin?" "What did he say?" I met his gaze steadily. "Why does it matter?" His jaw clenched. "Because people talk. They spread lies. And you're too old to know what's real." I smiled faintly. "The thing about lies, son, is that they collapse under their own weight. Truth, though. Truth survives." His fists curled, then relaxed. He muttered something under his breath and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. When the house settled into uneasy quiet, I returned to my study, pulled out the notebook, and wrote in deliberate strokes, Stage 2 confirmed. Outside witness, paranoia rising. I underlined the words until the ink bled through. The war was no longer silent. It was visible, audible, leaking through the cracks in their composure. Brandon's swagger had sharpened into agitation. Tessa whispered with a tremor in her voice. Linda folded laundry like it was penance, her shoulders tight, her silence heavier. They still believed I was the old man breaking down blind to their schemes. But in truth, they were the ones unraveling. And I, steady, silent patient, was only getting started. By the third morning, I knew patience alone wouldn't win this war. A man can stand his ground, but even a foxhole needs reinforcement. I needed someone outside this house, someone who still knew me as more than a cane and a prosthetic. Someone who remembered the man I had been before Brandon ever learned to sneer. That's how I found myself boarding the bus to the next town, over the metal floor vibrating beneath my feet, the heater rattling weakly. I sat among strangers staring out at frozen fields, my thoughts circling back to the desert convoys years ago, long tense rides with rifles across our laps, and silence that meant survival. Some rhythms never leave you. The bus hissed to a stop in front of a modest workshop, its sign faded windows fogged from the heat inside. The smell of sawdust and machine oil rushed out when I opened the door. Behind the counter stood a broad-shouldered man, hair more silver now than when I'd last seen him, but his eyes sharp as ever. "Jack Mercer," he said, surprise flickering across his face before melting into a grin. "Red," I replied, letting the name roll off my tongue like an old anthem. Mike Red Dalton stepped forward and gripped my hand. His shake was still iron, the same grip that once dragged me from a blast zone when shrapnel tore my leg apart. Without him, I'd never have lived to see Brandon born. That debt ran deeper than scars. "It's been too damn long," Red said, motioning for me to sit. "And don't tell me this is just for old times. I can see the storm in your eyes." "You're right," I said, lowering myself onto the stool. "I wish it were nostalgia. But I need help." His smile faded into the seriousness of a man who knew too many wars. "Tell me." So I did. I told him about the insult at the table, about the missing papers, about the recording of Brandon and Tessa, whispering of guardianship, while Linda's silence lent its weight. I told him about Kevin Brooks at the courthouse, about Victor Hale's advice, about the way every look in my house carried calculation instead of care. By the time I finished, Red's jaw was set like stone. He crossed his arms and shook his head slowly. "Your own blood," he muttered. "I've seen betrayal in foxholes, but this cut's different." "It does," I admitted quietly. "And I can't fight it alone. I need someone I can trust. Someone who remembers who I was before they started calling me a burden." "You've still got fight in you," he said firmly. "I can see it. What do you need, eyes?" "Ears. Maybe muscle, if it comes to that. But most of all, someone who won't flinch when things get ugly." Red didn't hesitate. He extended his hand across the counter. "Then you've got me." "Always did." We clasped hands, rough and sure, and in that grip I felt not just loyalty, but the spark of the man I used to be. That afternoon we sat in the back of his workshop, away from curious ears. He opened a drawer and pulled out scraps of paper, old receipts and photographs of us, younger, grinning in the sand, sweat and dust, painting our faces. He tapped the photo. "That man isn't gone, Jack. He's just been quiet. Time to let him speak again." I smiled faintly. Quiet can be dangerous. That's what I'm counting on. Before I left, Red handed me a slim device, an upgraded recorder, sleeker, clearer, almost invisible. "Use this," he said. "Plant it where they can't resist talking. People like that always slip when they think no one's listening." I pocketed it like a weapon. The ride home was darker dusk, shadowing the fields, but inside I felt lighter. I wasn't alone anymore. When I stepped back into the house, Linda looked up from her armchair where she was mending a shirt. Out late, she observed. Old friend, I replied evenly. Needed catching up. Her hands paused for just a moment before resuming. Friends can be useful. She murmured, her tone casual, but sharp enough to draw blood. She suspected, maybe even knew, but I gave her nothing more. That night, as we gathered around the table, Brandon tapped his fork against his plate, his leg bouncing. "Dad," he said tightly, "we should really set a date with the lawyer. Get things signed. No sense dragging this out." I chewed slowly, savoring not the food, but the taste of his impatience. Dragging out, I echoed, sometimes reveals who has stamina and who doesn't. His eyes narrowed. "What are you up to?" I repeated, feigning innocence. "Just dinner with my family." Tessa tried to ease the tension, but the mask was slipping. Sweat glistened faintly at Brandon's temple. His jaw twitched. He was unraveling. Later, when the house had gone still, I crouched under the table and replaced the old recorder with the new one Red had given me. Sleeker, sharper, ready to catch every whisper. My fingers brushed the wood scarred by decades of meals, laughter, and arguments. This table had seen the rise and fall of my family. Now it would bear witness to their undoing. The next few days I worked as carefully as a sapper laying charges beneath a bridge. Every move small, deliberate, designed to look harmless while carrying weight enough to split stone when the time came. I made sure to be seen. At the post office, I asked about forwarding addresses loud enough for the clerk and the two folks waiting in line to overhear. At the lawyer's office downtown, I visited Victor without revealing a word of what we discussed, only letting people see me walk in with my cane and folder, then leave with a measured calm. At the gas station, I struck up a conversation within earshot of others, hinting that I might be making arrangements soon. Each act was a pebble dropped into a pond. Each ripple reached Brandon sooner or later. On the third night, I retrieved the recorder from under the table and carried it into my study. I set the device on the desk, pressed play, and leaned back, listening. The voices came clear as church bells. Brandon's voice, frantic. "He's hiding something. I know it. If we don't get control soon, we'll lose everything." Then Linda's voice, lower, weary but sharp enough to cut, then push harder. "He won't fight back if you corner him." I sat in the dim light, those words repeating in my head, each syllable like a nail hammered into a coffin. My wife, the woman who once kissed my scars and whispered that survival was enough, was now instructing my son on how to finish me. I didn't feel rage. Not exactly. What I felt was clarity. When someone shows you who they are, you believe them. Then you prepare accordingly. I slid the tape into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote Victor's name on the front. Tomorrow, he would have it. Tomorrow, another bullet would be chambered. That night at dinner, Brandon tried again. He dabbed his mouth with a napkin, forced a calm he didn't feel. "Dad, we need to talk about the will," he said. "It's outdated. Things have changed. You should think about what's fair." "Fair," I repeated softly, tasting the word. "Yes," he said. "You don't need much, just enough to be comfortable. Let the rest go to people who can use it. Me, Tessa, the kids. We'll make it work." I looked at him, really looked at him, and remembered the boy who once clung to my arm during thunderstorms, eyes wide with trust. That boy was gone. In his place sat a man who saw me as an obstacle, a ledger waiting to be signed. "Complicated," I said quietly. "Sometimes it's another word for justice." He frowned, confused by my calm. "Don't be difficult," he muttered, pushing back his chair. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Silence again, pressed harder than words. Later, after the house slept, I returned to the study and wrote in my notebook, Stage 3 begins. Allies gathered, enemy exposed. I underlined the last phrase until the pen nearly tore the paper. Then I set the notebook aside, extinguished the lamp, and let the silence settle over me like armor. The battlefield wasn't theoretical anymore. The war had left the shadows, and soon, very soon, the first strike would fall. The confrontation came on a cold Saturday morning sunlight, pale and brittle through the living room curtains. I sat in my chair with an old journal balanced on my knee, flipping through pages filled with memories of sand and steel. The front door banged open hard enough to rattle the frame. Brandon stormed in, Tessa right behind him, with her arms crossed, chin tilted high. Linda trailed after them, her face pale, her hands twisting in front of her. "Enough games." Dad Brandon barked, slamming a thick folder onto the coffee table. Papers spilled out, stamped and official. "We're done waiting." I closed the journal carefully, laid it on the side table, and lifted my eyes to him. "Is that so?" He shoved the folder closer. "Guardianship petition. We're filing Monday morning. By the end of the month, you won't be able to move a dime without my approval." Tessa's voice chimed in, sugar laced with poison. "It's for your own good. You're not the man you used to be. You can't manage these things anymore. You'll thank us one day." I turned my gaze to Linda. She flinched, tears brimming but unspilled. "And you?" I asked softly. "Do you stand with them?" Her lips parted, then closed again. Silence, her answer, written in the absence of words. I exhaled slowly, steadying my voice. "You think you've already won?" Brandon smirked. "We're not thinking, Dad. We know." For a long moment, the room was suffocatingly still. Then I leaned forward, my tone precise and cold. "Do you know what I learned in war, that arrogance is the last step before defeat? You assume that because you have papers, because you make noise, that you've cornered me. But while you were drawing up documents, I was documenting you." His face twitched. "What are you talking about?" I tapped the journal on the side table. "Every call, every whisper, every word you've spoken in this house about my incapacity. Every plan to force a signature. Every scheme about money. Victor Hale has copies. The lawyer has them filed." For the first time, doubt flickered in Brandon's eyes. Tessa's lips parted, but no words came. Linda gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. I stood slowly, cane pressing into the carpet, my posture unbroken. "Leave this house. Take your papers with you. Monday morning will come soon enough. We'll see whose truth the court believes." The silence that followed was jagged, suffocating. Brandon's jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck bulged. He stuffed the papers back into the folder with rough hands, stormed toward the door, and slammed it behind him. Tessa followed quickly, her heels striking sharp against the wood floor. Linda lingered for a heartbeat, torn between two worlds, then turned and trailed after them, her shoulders shaking. The house fell still again, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of ground reclaimed. That night, I sat in my study with the desk lamp casting a thin cone of light. The envelope containing the latest recording sat on top of the metal box, ready for Victor. My notebook lay open. With deliberate strokes, I wrote, "Enemy exposed. Documents revealed. Court imminent. Hold position." My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. Decades of discipline had brought me to this moment where patience would finally crush arrogance. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the quiet steady me. The first real battle would be fought in the courthouse, and for once I wasn't dreading it. I was ready. The morning of the hearing, I dressed with the same precision I once used to assemble gear before a mission. My old suit hung a little tighter than it used to, but I pressed the jacket flat with careful hands, tightened the knot in my tie, and polished my shoes until they carried a muted shine. The cane stood by the door, waiting like an old comrade. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a crippled man on his way to be judged. I saw a soldier stepping onto a battlefield. Linda lingered near the doorway, wringing her hands. Her eyes were red, her voice a whisper. Jack, please don't make this ugly. He's still our son. I met her gaze, steady as stone. What's uglier, Eleanor, truth in the light or lies in the dark? She had no answer. Arthur pulled up in front of the house a few minutes later. He gave me a short nod, the kind men give before a mission when there's no room left for doubt. I climbed into his car folder of evidence under my arm. We drove in silence, the courthouse rising ahead like a fortress. Inside, the smell of polished wood and stale air greeted us. Brandon and Tessa were already seated with their lawyer, smug expressions painted on their faces. Linda sat beside them, pale and trembling, caught between loyalty and fear. When Brandon's eyes met mine, he smiled not with warmth, but with the cold triumph of a man who believed victory already belonged to him. The judge entered, a stern woman with sharp glasses and a voice that cut like steel. This hearing is to consider the petition for guardianship over Mr. Jack Mercer, age 71. Their lawyer rose, first words flowing smooth as oil. He painted me as unstable, forgetful, incapable of managing my own affairs. He cherry-picked stories, twisted details, even cited my limp, as though missing a leg somehow crippled my mind. Brandon nodded solemnly, playing the role of the concerned son. Tessa dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her expression dripping with staged sorrow. I sat still, hands folded over my cane, patience steady. A battlefield is a battlefield, whether bullets or words. You don't interrupt the enemy while he's wasting his ammunition. When the lawyer finished, the judge turned. "Mr. Mercer, do you have representation?" Arthur stood. "Your Honor, I represent Mr. Mercer, and we contest this petition." She nodded. "Proceed." Arthur lifted the folder, his voice plain and steady. "Before we debate capacity, I'd like to submit evidence." One by one, he laid out the transcripts, recordings, notes, witness statements. He read aloud Brandon's own words. "We'll push him until he signs. If not, we'll take it to court. He won't last long anyway." The courtroom shifted. Murmurs rippled through the benches. Brandon's face paled. Tessa stiffened. Linda closed her eyes. Arthur didn't stop. Exhibit B phone logs with threats of coercion. Exhibit C statements from neighbors confirming the petitioners discussed removing Mr. Mercer for access to his estate, not his welfare. The judge's eyes sharpened. "Overruled," she said firmly, when their lawyer tried to object. "Continue." When Arthur finished, he looked at me. "Mr. Mercer, would you tell the court about your daily life?" I rose, slowly leaning on the cane, letting silence settle before I spoke. "Your Honor, I cook my meals. I manage my accounts. I keep records. I read the newspaper every morning, front to back. I may walk with a limp, but my mind has never limped a single day." Gasps stirred in the gallery. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, can you demonstrate your financial competence?" I slid a document from my coat pocket. "This is my current portfolio. Balanced, diversified, every figure checked last week. Not by a broker, by me." She studied the papers, her brow softening as she scanned the numbers. Then she looked at Brandon. "Do you contest these figures?" he stammered. "Bravado, crumbling." We didn't know. It appears," the judge said sharply, "you didn't know much at all except how to manipulate." Their lawyer scrambled. "Your Honor, we acted only out of concern." Concern, the judge's tone cracked like a whip. Concern does not sound like plotting inheritance before a man is even in his grave. Brandon's eyes darted down, shame creeping through the cracks of arrogance. Then Arthur handed over the sealed envelope. The judge opened it, her eyes narrowing, then widening. "This is a will executed, notarized, and valid." She looked at me. "Would you care to explain, Mr. Mercer?" "Yes, Your Honor." My voice was calm, each word deliberate. While they spent months preparing to bury me alive in paperwork, I prepared my own. This will reflect my decision, not theirs. Arthur spoke clearly. In this will, Mr. Mercer leaves his son nothing. The estate is placed in a trust for charitable causes, benefiting veterans with secondary provisions for his wife, contingent on her independence. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, outrage. Brandon shot to his feet. "You can't do this, I'm his son." I met his eyes' voice, cutting clean. "Blood makes you my son. Actions decide if you're my heir. You chose greed, you chose betrayal. And in doing so, you chose nothing." The judge struck her gavel hard. "Order this court denies the petition for guardianship. Furthermore, I recommend investigation into attempted exploitation." Brandon collapsed into his chair, pale and sweating. Tessa stared straight ahead, her mask shattered. Linda sobbed quietly, caught between devastation and release. I stood, tall cane, steady heart, steady. Arthur gripped my shoulder. "You did it, Jack." I shook my head slightly. No. Truth did. Outside, the autumn air felt cleaner than it had in years. I had walked into their trap, but they had walked into mine. The courthouse doors closed behind us, heavy wood shutting out the echo of the gavel. Arthur walked a step ahead, the manila folder tucked under his arm, his posture steady. Beside me, Linda moved slowly, her eyes swollen from tears. She whispered almost too softly to hear. "I'm sorry." I stopped on the steps, turned my gaze toward her, and let the silence stretch until she looked up. "Sorry isn't enough to erase what almost happened," I said quietly. "But maybe it's enough to start over. The question is, whose side will you stand on now?" Her lips trembled. She nodded faintly but said nothing. I didn't press. Sometimes silence is the only truth a person can give. Arthur drove me home. The autumn air cut crisp through the window, maple leaves tumbling down like embers of a fire, long burned out. I leaned back in the seat cane, resting across my lap, watching the town roll past. The whispers that had once gnawed at me now seemed powerless. The truth had stood its ground, and that was enough. At home, the house felt different, emptier, but lighter. Brandon's voice still rang in memory, sharp and cruel. "You're nothing but a burden." But the sting was gone. The word had lost its power. He had tried to turn it into a weapon, and in the end, it was the blade that cut him down. I sat in my study that evening, notebook, open pen, steady in my hand. Across the top of the page, I wrote, "Final stage, victory secured." Beneath it, 3 lines, enemy exposed. Truth upheld, legacy protected. I underlined the last one twice. On the shelf above me sat the folded flag given at a comrade's funeral, its edges worn, but still sharp. I reached up, placed my hand against it, and let the weight of memory settle. Men had died, believing sacrifice meant something, that truth would outlive them. Today, in that courthouse, I felt I had finally honored that belief. Linda moved softly through the house that night, quieter than before. When she paused in the doorway of my study, her eyes searching mine, I simply nodded. She didn't step closer, didn't speak, but she lingered a moment longer than she had in years. I turned back to the window. The street lamp outside cast a pale circle of light on the pavement, and I thought of Caleb, my grandson. Someday he would learn the story of this battle, not from whispers or twisted words, but from the truth written down and kept safe. He would learn that strength isn't the absence of scars, but the patience to endure them. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I wrote one final line in my notebook. I wasn't the burden. I was the survivor. Then I closed the book, leaned back, and let the silence fill the room. Not the silence of betrayal, but of victory, hard-earned, steady, and complete. What my family forgot, and what I hope none of you will, is this patience and truth are the sharpest weapons we'll ever wield. People may call you weak, useless, or a burden, but those words only have power if you let them. Prove your worth not by shouting, but by standing steady and unbroken when the storm passes. If this story moved, you share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that remind us all truth always wins, no matter how long it takes.